to MFA Riders. It's hard to believe it's already October. So for those of you planning to apply to MFA programs this year, now's the time to be diving into those applications in earnest. The first deadlines are in December, and take it from me, they come quickly. My advice is to start early, which will, in my experience, save you a lot of stress later. So good luck to all of you who are applying this cycle. I hope our podcast brings you a bit of solace knowing at least you aren't alone. You can find MFA Riders on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfariders.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfariderspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing riders. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfariders.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/MFAriders. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Riders, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Carlee Jensen. Carlee is a fiction writer and educator raised in Utah and California, and currently living in Baltimore, Maryland. She earned a BA from Yale University and an MS from Bank Street College of Education, and spent 7 years as a classroom teacher before pursuing an MFA from the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. During her time at Johns Hopkins, she received the 2024 Benjamin J. Sankey Award in fiction. Her work has appeared in New Ohio Review and the Masters Review, where it was selected by Kristen Arnett for a 2022 Short Story Award for New Writers, and it was a finalist for American Short Fiction's Shorter Fiction Prize in 2023. Today, Carlee has brought a piece of fiction to read for us.
My name is Carlee Jensen, and this is the beginning of my short story, The Girls. On the hard, packed sand, lips salty and legs speckled brown, the girls watch hermit crabs caught in the surf. They watch the glint of their borrowed shells, how they dive under the mud as the water rushes forward, disappearing bodies large as stones before the salt and foam can overtake them. They go head first, urgent and purposeful, separating sand with swift scooping motions of their legs. A little one clings to a bigger one's retreating back, hitches a ride. "That's us," Alexis tells her sister, pointing. It is 1998, the last hot week of June. She is 9 years old. Emma will be 8 soon. At home, they sleep in twin beds close enough to touch. And when Alexis wakes up sweating from bad dreams, it is the whistle of her little sister's breathing that soothes her back to sleep. Still, she thinks of herself as the big crab. She loops her hand in Emma's when they cross a busy street, lets her steal the starchy milk at the bottom of her cereal bowl. Some crabs move too slowly and are swept away. The sight of these unfortunates tumbling head over feet toward the waiting ocean stirs in Alexis some combination of empathy and dark fascination. She imagines them tossed in the chomping tide, the world gone dark with sediment and runoff, their tiny pincers grasping for an anchor. In the public pool at home, the girls compete to see who can hold her breath the longest. On the count of 3, they wrap their arms around their knees and sink themselves to the bottom of the shallow end. They blink at each other through the chlorine and strange legs, twist their faces to make each other laugh. When one finally cracks, pushes up to the surface with bubbles streaming from her nose, the game begins again. They can waste whole afternoons this way, amphibious, barely breathing. They don't swim here in California. They don't even wade up to their knees. They are desert girls, raised on snowmelt and well water, and they are frightened of the ocean's dazzling enormity. Even from this cautious distance, they feel the staggering force behind each wave, how it clatters to the shore and keeps on racing, how it gulps up everything in its path. 20 yards up from the shoreline, the girl's mother lounges on a blanket. while Emma sloshes her hand in the shallow water, sifting sand between her fingers until only tiny seashells remain. Alexis glances over her shoulder. She wants to catch her mother in some posture of concerned attention, propped on her elbows, scanning the crowd for her daughter's damp ponytails, but her posture is what it was 5 minutes ago, and 20 and 120, dozing in the sand with one long, freckled arm draped over her face. Her new bathing suit, a stark white two-piece, sits high on her hips and reveals smooth, full thighs like slabs of steak. It is not the kind of bathing suit that mothers are supposed to wear, but the girl's mother is different from other mothers. Their mother is young and beautiful and special. There has never been a time when the girls did not know this. Carmen, though, is watching them. She sits right beside the girl's mother, upright on the blanket, with her arms slung over her knees. Carmen doesn't wear a bathing suit, just a pair of long shorts and a t-shirt whose cuffed sleeves draw attention to her wiry, muscular arms. When their mother told them about her friend in Los Angeles, a friend who worked in the movies and lived by the beach, the girls imagined someone glamorous and feminine, Jennifer Aniston or Ginger from Gilligan's Island. Carmen has been a spectacular disappointment. Her job, she revealed to them, is behind the camera. She raises fake walls and installs cabinets with nothing inside them. Her hair is short and coarse, speckled prematurely with gray. Alexis doesn't mean to catch her eye, but she does. Carmen waves at her cautiously, barely lifting the fingers on her right hand. On the girls' first night in Los Angeles, a child drowned in the surf at dusk. They were on the pier when it happened, eating corn dogs at a picnic table under the squealing roller coaster. They saw the ambulance screaming down the incline, watched it slice across 4 lanes of traffic and trundle over the sand like a tank. The boy was just 4 years old, some woman told Carmen at the counter where people pumped their condiments from a gallon tub. He was a few yards ahead of his mother, scampering after sandpipers, when a rogue wave pulled him out. She looked away for 1 second, and when she turned back, he was gone. The stranger who relayed this sad gossip was lanky and wild-looking, leathery from the sun. She either didn't notice Alexis or didn't care that she overheard. "Don't listen to her," Carmen insisted after the woman shuffled away, sandals thwacking on the damp boards. There's no way she could know all that. But as they carried the paper cups of ketchup back to their picnic table, cupped in their hands like stolen eggs, she bent her head and spoke right next to Alexis's ear. "Let's not tell your mom that story, okay? Something like that will just make her worry." She said this gently, solicitously, not an order, but an invitation to conspiracy. It bothered Alexis, who had never known an adult to seek her approval. Still, she understood that Carmen was right. The story would upset her mother, cast a pall over her sunny ease. And so the drowned boy became their secret. She didn't even tell Emma about him. It's been 3 days now, and she thinks of him every time she looks at the water.
Carlee, that was awesome. Thank you so much for reading, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start first with your upbringing because it seems to have a big influence on the writing you do today. Although you've been living in Baltimore for several years now, first as a teacher and then as a student in the Johns Hopkins MFA program, you spent your childhood in southern Utah and Los Angeles. You described Utah as a place that contains arrestingly beautiful landscapes that feel holy and humbling. And as listeners just heard, Los Angeles often shows up in your writing too. So what was it like growing up in those places, and how important are they to your writing today?
Yeah, I think maybe can't be overstated how formative those two places have been for me. Whenever I tell people that I grew up in southern Utah and Los Angeles, the reaction is always like, what a contrast.
Yeah.
And it's definitely was such a contrast. You know, I was raised for the first part of my childhood in a really small town where my mother had gone to high school and my family were there and everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
And then my mom met a guy and fell in love, and we moved to Los Angeles to like start this entire new life and new family. And, you know, I don't have to tell you about Los Angeles. It's a really different place that's also got its own intensities. And I think like intensity is probably the thing that both of those landscapes, both those places really have in common. Southern Utah is just so profoundly beautiful, and so epic and dramatic. I was, raised among these big, incredible mountains and driving through the Virgin River Gorge, and everything is really operating on this like geologic timescale. So I think the intensity of those landscapes, and particularly I think of the Southern Utah landscape, which, though I didn't spend my adolescence there and I haven't lived in Southern Utah for 20 years, I still feel so moved by it every time I'm there. And I still think about it and am often really orienting myself toward it. I think partly because I really did experience leaving Utah and leaving my family as a real loss when I was a child. And so, part of what brings me a lot of joy in my work is being able to return to those landscapes and be present in them in my writing, even as I'm far away and have been for a long time. But I also think that sort of cultural elements are really at the forefront as well. I didn't grow up in a particularly religious household, but Utah, of course, is famous as, having a very large and significant Mormon population and Mormon influence. And that's certainly part of my family history and part of the culture that I was sort of immersed in. So I think I'm also carrying with me this curiosity about faith and religion and community and what that looks like in all of these different shades. Yeah. And of course, like Los Angeles has its own answers to those questions, right? Its own answers to what kinds of things are holy and what kinds of things are permissible and significant. So I think operating between those contrasts is something that I'm always excited to try to do in whatever different ways the stories allow me to.
And before the interview, you told me you're particularly interested in Americana. And this has to tie into the things that we're talking about here, because you said you're really interested in the stories that we tell about ourselves in this country. So when did you first become interested in that idea, and how does that show up in your work?
I mean, I think I am just like fundamentally so curious about like how we tell stories to understand ourselves. And maybe that's like a very simple and straightforward like thing that everybody is interested in. But it seems to me like the most urgent question, right, is like the reality that we are all constantly engaged in this process of like myth making and fact finding simultaneously, which feels, I mean, when I think about particularly like the history and also the like really tremendous like body of narrative around the American West, that combination of myth making and fact finding feels like so integral to that history. And that idea of whether it's early members of the Mormon Church sort of pursuing this place that they understood to be an opportunity for them to realize God's kingdom on earth and like manifest these spiritual visions at whatever cost, right? Or, people moving to California to be movie stars, right? I think whatever layer you're looking at, there is this way in which like the history and the shape of the American West like really asks people to build deep relationships with their own sort of sense of mythology. But I also think that expands out of the American West. I certainly like wouldn't like draw a bright line around that region and say that was the exclusive purview of like, the West. But I think as a country overall, like we are so actively engaged on so many levels in like constructing the story of like who we are and what it means that we are who we are. So I'm often really drawn to sort of big figures and big moments in American history, American mythology, and sometimes try to interact with those directly in my work. But I think I'm even more, I'm really just interested in like the small scale versions of these stories, right? Individual people who are trying to figure out what story they're in. Yeah. And who maybe believe they're in one story and are trying to realize it and keep knocking up against the fact that it's not the story that they think they're in.
Right. And everyone has a different lived experience. So when you're trying to fit yourself into these kind of preconceived notions or like these ideas of what it means to be this certain thing, that doesn't always fit with the person that you are and your own lived experience. Like, for example, before the interview, you described yourself as a lesbian who was late to the whole coming out thing. And I imagine having that identity also affects your writing. It also affects the way you view Americana, also affects this place that you grow up. How couldn't it, right? So I'm also curious to hear you talk about that and the ways that you see that lens changing the way you view these things.
Yeah, I think this is another question of like not knowing what story you're in. I think especially because I come from a region that's so deeply connected with religion, and with a religion that has such a complicated way of relating to queerness, that there is one story that feels like it should fit, which is the story of finding one's own queerness through a strictly oppressive, like Christian lens. I think there's another story of like queerness as a thing that a person always sort of feels bubbling in them and maybe always has access to, and that, you know, when you finally speak it, it's like the culmination of this strong and consistent current that has been like running through every minute of your life. And certainly I don't think either one of those stories worked for me. And I think that anyone who has had the experience of coming out would say that like coming out is a thing that happens in like layer after layer after layer. And you do it 500,000 times. And some of them are a little bit more dramatic than others. So I didn't really like come out in a way that felt complete and vocal and public until I was 25, which I know is not objectively all that old, but to me at the time, I felt like I was the oldest person on earth and that I had missed all of my opportunities to like have a full and fully realized queer life. But I think part of what was complicated for me in that was because I felt like I was so sort of late to the party and so late in really putting together my understanding of the life that I wanted and needed to live. I felt myself like grasping backwards with this like forensic attitude, trying to figure out like, why did it take so long? Like what? And also like, was it always happening? And I just wasn't really getting the message. And like, certainly I can go back and tell a version of my own life that highlights, you know, me as a kid, like reading the book review for Call Me By Your Name in the LA Times and not understanding why I was feeling this way, right? But like, you know, those moments, it's not that, certainly not that they didn't exist, but that I think I had this deep desire to fit into some kind of a story that would explain how I had ended up where I was and how I had gotten there so late, right? Which was just something that I felt so much like shame and anxiety and frustration about, and anger and all the emotions. I felt all of the emotions. But I think like one of the things that I really think writing so much about this has helped me to understand, and writing so many queer characters and so many different kind of iterations, is that there is no narrative, right? That there is no linear narrative. It's not that I had one that just wasn't represented by the archetypes. It's that it was deeply nonlinear and weird and amorphous, and that the truth is never going to feel kind of narratively satisfying, which I think is also true of like so many aspects of history and so many aspects of like culture, right? Just, I think that's a fundamental truth about being human, is that like what is real is often not that narratively satisfying. So I do think that I'm really motivated in my work, whether it's the more like fact and history driven aspects of my work, or the more kind of introspective, personal aspects of my work. I am really driven by this question of like, how do you make sense and make story and create meaning from the realities of the world, without sacrificing that truth that feels so precious to me, which is the nonlinearity and the messiness and the impossibility of it.
And, you have this interesting home that you came from, this interesting family history and personal experience that you can draw from for your writing. But you told me that you rarely plan a thing before you write it. I'm curious to hear you talk about your drafting and discovery process and how you approach your work with an open mind. I imagine you have to kind of be open to just moment by moment how you're feeling as you're writing.
Yeah, I think that is the thing that is most significant for me in writing, is the way that it really forces me to like pry open like my own heart and mind and like allow whatever is in there to surface. I usually start drafting with very little information about what's happening. And I have tried to work from a place of more structure. And every time I try, I find it so unsatisfying. So usually I start writing with just like a little grain of something. Usually it's a situation. So in the example of the piece that I read, it really did start with this idea of these two young girls on a beach watching hermit crabs and just watching the water. And it really feels often like the lens like slowly widening. So it starts with this like tight little focus on these two girls. And I write that paragraph and I'm feeling great. And then the anxiety like comes in. I think, oh God, like, well, who else is there, right? Who else is like on that beach? And what, where are they? What beach is it? What is the situation that's brought them to this moment? And I sometimes talk about drafting as having my hands on the planchet of a Ouija board and being like, is it this? And it goes, no. And like, is it this? And yes. And like that kind of idea that there's like a little trial and error or testing and seeing and feeling what feels right. Like just inches in front of me as I work, which often leads me to like first drafts that have massive holes in them and come together very slowly and painstakingly. But I do really feel like as I sink deeper into a story, as I continue to kind of ask those questions and get those little answers back one thing at a time, that thing inside of me opens wider and becomes more permeable, and that everything sort of supplies itself a lot more readily as I'm in better contact with the life and the world of the story.
Yeah. I imagine that means that revision is also super important, right? If you are like slowly figuring out the story as you go. I've written stories this way too. And I find sometimes I get halfway through and I'm like, yes, this is a story. And then I realize, well, I'm going to have to rewrite the whole first half of it,
Yeah.
So how is the revision process usually for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think I often find when I look at a story that is sort of finished insofar as it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and is ready to be revised, I find that like there are these massive structural things that I really would like to like undo and redo and rework. But at the same time, I also think that like part of what has been like a real gift of being in the MFA for me has been turning out these drafts that feel searching and uncertain, and discovering that like my own self-criticism of them is not always totally aligned with how other people are receiving them. So I might look at a draft on my own and think, well, this makes no sense and it's so silly and it's kind of going off in all these different directions. And then I'm able to like get somebody else's perspective on it and see the logical threads and connections that are coming out for them. And I have found that to actually be a really wonderful resource in my revision process, in trying to think about the structural elements of a piece.
Well, as I mentioned briefly earlier, you moved to Baltimore not for the MFA program, but actually to be a teacher. Your background is in childhood education, and you spent 7 years as a classroom teacher before applying to MFA programs and eventually ending up in the Johns Hopkins MFA program, which is technically called the Writing Seminars, a 2-year fully funded program with tracks in fiction and poetry. What made you decide to pursue the MFA? I
think that I wanted to pursue an MFA from the second that I found out that the MFA was a thing that existed on the planet. I don't remember when I first heard about it, but I certainly remember the feeling of being, I don't know, a teenager and hearing that this was a thing people did, and my heart just lighting up. So I think it was always in my kind of viewfinder as something that I wanted to think about and to pursue, but kind of without planning to. I finished my undergraduate degree and wound up in a job teaching elementary school, and discovered, much to my surprise, that it was the greatest job in the universe, and that I loved it, and that I had found work that really felt like it was part of my calling on this planet. And so I kind of got swept up in that. I ended up getting a master's degree in childhood education from Bank Street College of Education in New York City, which was such a phenomenal educational experience, and left me feeling so purposeful and so excited about having a career as a teacher. And then I moved to Baltimore for a job that I really loved, teaching fifth grade. And I felt really, really grounded and really happy doing that. And I also was always using my little time when the kids were at lunch or when they went to art class, writing my little stories on the back of, an extra sheet of math homework, or, I always had this writing life that I just didn't ever want to put aside or really feel like I could put aside. And I also got really lucky when I came to Baltimore, insofar as I, again, totally accidentally, which seems to be the theme of so many things in my life, stumbled into the path of friends who were really talented, passionate writers, and who kept books and writing and the artistic life kind of centered in my day-to-day life in Baltimore. So I was also writing stories to send to my friends and just to amuse them, right? And I think the realization that I still had this really potent creative life that I wanted to feed, and that I also really wanted to, not just to spend my time writing, but to really actively try to build community with other writers, and to try to think about what a professional life as a writer could mean, the many different forms that could take, led me to make the decision to leave the classroom, in a manner of speaking, because I was still teaching at Johns Hopkins, but to leave the elementary classroom, which is such a distinctive place, and kind of center that writing life. And it definitely wasn't an easy decision. It didn't feel like it was without cost. I will also flag that a lot of this happened after, a year and a half of pandemic teaching. And I was very lucky. I felt very supported by my school in many ways during the pandemic, which I know not every teacher did. And I had a lot of resources from my school to help make that easier, which I know not every teacher did. But it was also a period of time when, in order to continue to show up for my students and to be a functional person, I found that making time every day to write and to be in that part of my life was absolutely necessary, and was the thing that really was sustaining me in so many ways. And so I think the surfacing of that writing life as a really crucial part of my existence during the pandemic was also part of what made it feel like it was the right time.
Well, I want to talk about the application process a bit, because you told me that you actually avoided reading too much about the application and what you were supposed to write in the application before applying. What was your motivation for that?
I think just pure anxiety. I think there's that expression, comparison is the thief of joy. And it's so true. It's so true for me. I am just not somebody who functions very well when I know how everyone else is doing or what they're doing. I think I only had two people in my life who I was close enough to talk to about it, who had been through the MFA. And so I was very grateful to have those two people in my life to sort of talk to them a little bit about what their process had looked like. But even those two people who were unbelievably like gracious and gentle with me, like I found that like my impulse to compare myself to them was like undeniable. So I think I just understood that if I was immersing myself in like the robust online world of like people applying to MFAs, and if I was in a situation where I could hear where everyone else was applying and what did everybody think of this program or that program, and like what was a good program and what was a bad program, and who had gotten their acceptances and who hadn't, I think I would have just like truly, truly lost my mind and been unable to kind of go forward in the process. And I think being a little bit outside of that not only protected my like my sanity and my sense of well-being, but I think also allowed me to make the decisions that felt like they were most authentic to me. So, you know, I was very grateful to have examples from my friends who had applied to MFA programs of what kind of shape a personal statement could take. But I really deeply did not want to know what everybody was doing for their personal statement. And I think that allowed me, you know, to just say what felt true. And the same thing in my writing sample, to just try to make the decision that felt like it was the right decision for me. And maybe if I were like maybe a person with a little bit of a stronger character, then that wouldn't have been necessary. But I think given how much anxiety I was bringing to the process, I think it really was the right choice for me.
Well, I think this relates actually to the MFA experience in general, because when you get into an MFA, you're going to obviously be seeing what other people are writing. You're going to be getting a lot of advice on process, how to write a story, what a story has to look like to get published, where you should be sending your story, what success looks like in this craft. How do you handle all of that? Because in my experience, I think you need to kind of protect yourself from it a little bit as you go through the MFA process. It's good to take in all this advice and all this information, but it's also probably wise to compartmentalize it a little bit just to protect yourself and make sure that you're not losing the artist that you are as you go through this process.
Yeah. And I think this is an area where I have felt so deeply grateful to Johns Hopkins and to the people that I've known there. I think I brought into the MFA a real concern with the professional side of writing and a real sense that the MFA was a professional opportunity. And I think that's accurate in a lot of ways. But I think one of the great gifts that I received from, whether it was my professors or my classmates or other people I encountered at Johns Hopkins, was like a gentle but firm reorientation toward remembering that like writing is making art, writing is exploring ideas. Like it isn't like something you do on LinkedIn, right? Like it's something that takes the time that it takes and that is only as good or as meaningful as it is like emotionally honest and rigorous and like pushing boundaries and exploring things. And I think like that the culture at Hopkins really helped me to stay oriented toward that. I also made some decisions just for myself. I decided not to pursue publication while I was actively like in the MFA. And part of that was just because I felt like my work was changing so rapidly that I could write something and then look at it a month later and feel like, what is this garbage? Not because I was so self-critical, but because it felt like it had been written by a different person. But I also think that like just putting a pin in that side of things while I was doing the actual program was really helpful to me and just giving me a little bit of breathing room to focus on doing the work as best I could. And then just in terms of getting like the feedback on the work itself, like I was so grateful for the incisiveness and the rigor and the kindness of my classmates and of my professors. which really was so beautiful. And I often felt like when somebody said something about my stories, like it was actually this lovely and powerful sense of recognition, right? The sense of having had the work seen really clearly and really compassionately by somebody who had my best interest at heart. So I didn't experience like so much of the angst around the kind of feedback that I was getting, just because the feedback itself was so high quality and so meaningful. But I also, obviously, as I think anyone who is getting a ton of feedback will, like I had moments when I would feel in myself that sense of resistance. Like, I don't actually think that's what I want for this piece, or I don't know if that's what I want for this character. And I would feel that even sometimes when people who I respected really, really deeply were talking. And I think becoming aware of the fact that I had that voice inside of me at all, like that I had the capacity for resistance, and kind of like observing that and nurturing that a little bit, was another piece of this that was really helpful. Because as much as I would sometimes get feedback and feel that glowing sense of like recognition and alignment, I would sometimes get feedback that I didn't agree with and feel that resistance and feel like really strong in that resistance, insofar as like it made me feel this sense of ownership over the work itself.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like there's a really good sense of community within the program, between the students and between students and faculty. What about the community in Baltimore as a whole? What's it like living in Baltimore? What's the artistic community like there? I know you've been living there for a while, even before the MFA. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Baltimore as a place to live and write.
Yeah, Baltimore is an amazing place to be an artist of any kind. I guess I shouldn't say an artist of any kind, because I'm only one kind of artist. And anyone who's ever heard me sing will know that. But but it's a really, really wonderful city in so many ways. I feel like it has this like improvisational kind of almost like slapdash, and I say that in like the most tender and appreciative way, like attitude about so many things. So Baltimore is like really chock full of like independent bookstores where you can like really go and talk to somebody who is really, really passionate about literature, or you can go and listen to somebody read, and often like local people who are just showing up at like this wine bar on a Wednesday night to like read their poems. And there is this sense of like an appreciation for things that are sort of done by hand, right? That have like this hard scrabble, like rough edged quality to them. Just the other day, I was like in line for the bathroom at a brewery, and I was gazing at like all of the beautiful, like painted cardboard scenery and like paper mache puppets that had been made by the Baltimore Rock Opera Society to put on a rock opera called A Computer That Loves, which was done by like just local Baltimoreans volunteering their time and like putting together this show. And I think that I think that Baltimore really has opened my eyes to creativity as a way of living, as opposed to like an endeavor. And I keep kind of like coming back to this idea of like the professional and the artistic. And I don't mean to be like constantly trying to sever those two. And I don't think that's necessary or even good or truthful. But I think what living in Baltimore has shown me is that like you can get people together in your living room and like play music and knit and talk and that's making art, right? Like that is what art is for, right? That you can get together in like a used bookstore and have like a couple of people stand up at a rinky-dink microphone and everyone's drinking rinky-dink natty boh. And like, that is art. Like that is what it's for, is like to bring us together in like this fullness of our capacity to see each other. And I think being grounded in that has been like unbelievably valuable for me as a writer. I really love this city for so many reasons. But one of the things that I always say is like that it's always just been a place where I felt so free. And I think that's true for me, as a human being and also as a writer.
Well, in true Baltimore form, you worked in a Natty Boh reference, so I'm proud of you.
I have to do it for my community. I have to get it in there. Yeah.
All right. So I mentioned earlier the Johns Hopkins MFA is a fully funded program that provides full tuition, health insurance, and $39,000 a year in exchange for teaching. That's according to the website. What's teaching been like at JHU?
Yeah, the students at Hopkins are so cool. They really are such cool people. I was really excited about being in a program that had a teaching component. I know most of them do, but it was a part of the work that I knew was going to be really rewarding and also like really important to getting the other work done. Hopkins is known, and I guess in my experience, rightfully known as a magnet for like the STEM people of the world. And the vast majority of my students have been pre-meds or engineering majors or chemistry majors. Most of them are coming from the sciences and are in my classes. All of the MFA students at Johns Hopkins teach one of the 2 introduction to fiction and poetry courses. So we sort of alternate between those courses depending on the semester. It's a 2-course sequence. So kids can take IFP 1 and IFP 2. So most of them are coming into intro to fiction and poetry with limited experience in writing, or perhaps no experience in creative writing. Often they're in the courses to sort of fulfill a humanities requirement, fulfill a writing requirement. And it's really a privilege and a pleasure to get to talk with these students who are, on the whole, just like really bright, really diligent, like really easy kids to teach, really easy students to teach, I should say, because they're not kids, they're grown people. But they're really great to have in class. And also, for many of them, they are experiencing aspects of reading fiction or aspects of reading poetry, or aspects of themselves as creative people that they haven't had a lot of time to explore. So part of that is just like the pure fun of like, I get to teach a bunch of pre-meds about Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff. Like, yeah, sign me up. Like, that sounds really fun. I want to sit and talk to these kids about like these great stories that like they probably haven't read before. But also I think one of the real joys is getting to see students come into their own as creative people and getting to see how their work evolves as they are really exposed to like certain ideas or certain craft moves that they maybe have never seen before, or at least have never really thought about. And, I've had the opportunity to teach some of my students in like 2 consecutive courses, to have them in IFP 1 and then have them again in IFP 2. And so in those cases, like you get to see so much growth and so much, such a deepening in how they're able to approach their writing. And I think it really also just keeps me connected to like constantly returning to this question of like, what is all this for, right? These are not necessarily students who are choosing to read fiction for pleasure. Of course, some of them are, but they aren't necessarily making that their number one priority, right? They aren't necessarily pursuing careers where like their ability to write, beautiful iambic pentameter is going to have a bearing on like how good a dentist they are or like how good an engineer they are. So I think what that's demanded of me that I've been really grateful for is like always returning to the question of like, who is literature for and what is literature for? And how can I, as a writer, like not necessarily just be thinking about like, what will the other writers that I know think about this? Or what are the other writers I know going to respond to? But like, what are the real like emotional needs or urgent questions that a person can be coming to in a piece of work?
It sounds really fun. So how many classes do you teach each semester in your 2 years in the program?
Yeah, so during the program itself, there is no teaching requirement the first semester, and instead the new students are enrolled in a pedagogy course where they're both like reading the text that they're going to be teaching in Intro to Fiction and Poetry, but also just talking about the practice of teaching and talking about elements of craft that they want to present to the students and how they can best do that. So starting in the second semester, it is one class per semester, either IFP1 or IFP2. Each of those classes has at most 15 students, sometimes many fewer than that, often exactly 15. And then Hopkins also has the optional third year, which is where I am now, where you are not taking any of your own classes, but you are teaching a 3-3 course load, so 3 courses each semester.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more, because it's a 2-year program, but there is this optional third year that seems pretty much available to anyone who wants it. I'm curious to hear what that process is like. Do you have to apply for that third year? Is it competitive? Is it pretty much available to everyone? And then once you get it, what's that third year like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of student demand for Intro to Fiction and Poetry. So it is not, to the best of my knowledge, it is not typically all that hard to fill up a number of sections of IFP. So essentially, at the end of their 2 years, graduating MFA students in both fiction and poetry have the opportunity to stay on for a third year. It is not something that you have to formally apply for. It is really about talking to the director of IFP and saying, yeah, I want to stay around. I want to stay at Hopkins. I want to stay in Baltimore. Sign me up for the third year. And there is an option to teach a 2-2 course load, so 2 sections a semester, which has a lower stipend and, to my knowledge, does not come with benefits, or to teach a 3-3 course load, which is 3 courses a semester and is considered full-time. And so it comes with all of the benefits, the health insurance, all that good stuff, and also a higher stipend. And then that's a one year kind of like soft landing out of the program, when you still have the ability to be on campus and be really involved in the life of the department. I am constantly like sticking my head into the grad student lounge and like asking the fiction writers if they want to send me their stories that they're working on, just because, I love their work and I miss reading it. And that also just gives you the flexibility that you have in a university environment to, have time to carve out for your writing, continuing to work on your writing.
Well, Carlee, it's been awesome getting to know you and hearing about your experience. Before we go, I have one last question for you. What is one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when applying?
This is hokey, but I really, really do think it's true. Like, I did not expect that the MFA was going to be a place where like I made a lot of friends, and where like I met people that I really, really feel so close to. I just was so focused in applying, and I think rightfully focused, on the writing and on the work and what was the work going to be and what was the academic side of it going to be. And it really, really caught me by surprise to like find myself in a room full of people who were not only just like really kind and really gracious and easy people to be around, but also like people whose minds I really loved, and people who I felt so close to the work that they were doing. And I felt so excited and energized and engaged by the work that they were doing. And so I think part of it is, I didn't really expect to make these kind of connections with people, but I also just didn't really realize how much the work that everybody else was doing was going to like feed and fuel and energize my own work. And it was such a beautiful part of the experience.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I'm glad you've had a good experience, and good luck as you finish out this third year. It's been really nice getting to know you. Thanks for stopping by and chatting with me.
Thank you so much, Jared.